This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke. This week we are going to take a turn into Slavic mythology for at least one episode. I've been doing some things with Egyptian. Next week I will have another figure from Roman mythology. Although Roman mythology and Slavic mythology tend to be they're somewhat unrelated, and yet there's also a closeness between them as well at times. And the deity we are going to discuss this week is Morana or Marzana. Marzana is the Polish name for this deity, but she's also known as Morana in Czech. And let's see, according to the entry I'm looking at here, it's Morana in Slovak or Macedonian, Mora in Bulgaria, Morena in Russia, Mara in the Ukraine, and More in Lithuania. So this is, it all seems to be from the same root, MOR, which has to do with, if we know the Latin word mort, is related to death. So this is, Morana or Marzana is a death goddess. So, now there's a podcast that I did back in, I want to say it was a podcast I had done in the spring. It was either, I want to say it was either 2019 or 2020. Can't quite remember at this point. Because it was, one of the first couple, rounds of recording episodes. But I did a podcast with Joanna Madloch, who I intend to have return for this month for a Chthonia conversation on Slavic mythology. And we had talked about the Marzana ritual in the podcast on Baba Yaga. So so to hear something firsthand from her, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode if you've not heard it, and also to check out the new conversation that I'm going to be having with her this month. Because the Marzana ritual is something that still very much goes on in Poland. And I know she has made efforts to maintain that with her own daughter now that she's living in the States. But it's so this is a Morana as a death goddess fits in a lot into the traditions that you see throughout Europe of death goddesses. But there's a very, very clear connection between Marzana and the kind of agricultural cycle. Okay, we see other death myths. For example, if you look at Persephone and Hades, and the way that the story of Persephone's abduction ends up becoming a motif for the coming of winter, coming of spring. And as we will see, Marzana is sometimes in certain sources, particularly in the Annales. It was a 15th century Polish chronicle. She's sometimes related to Kiris or Cirrus, depending on how you like to say it. I always say it with the K because I'm used to classical Latin. But who is also, in the Greek, is the goddess Demeter. So there is sometimes a connection between the two, although honestly, when we hear the stories of Morana, she may be more associated with I feel like there might be a little bit more of the Persephone side of the story rather than the Demeter one. And also in the Czech 13th century work called the Mater Verborum, or Verborum, she's compared to the goddess Hecate. And, because of her association with sorcery, poisonous herbs, and so forth. Now, these attempts to associate the Slavic deities with Greek and Roman gods is probably, on the one hand, there's probably, they probably arose independently of each other. But just as we saw with Greek deities in Rome, there did seem to be a tendency in that part of the world to try to, synchronize or create some kind of syncretism between these deities. You'll see that Mars, her name is Marzana in Poland. And as we're going to see when we look at her mythology, that there is a connection certainly to Mars. And if we know in Rome, Mars was actually not just a god of war, but also a god of agriculture. Okay. So where do we actually want to start here? Well, the most common thing that we know about Marzana is this ritual that is celebrated. And it's a very curious ritual. not necessarily out of character for European, what we call European folk ritual. And that is the idea that there's an effigy created of the goddess, usually made out of straw, which is either, burned or drowned or both. Okay. And the ritual was called Yare Sveto. And the idea of this ritual was to bring the approach of spring. This was a ritual that would take place around Easter, sometimes just after. I think as of the 20th century, the date for the ritual was set to the actual spring equinox rather than being necessarily lined up with Easter, although the dating of Easter always has to do with, the first full moon after the spring equinox. So they'd be pretty close in any case. Now, this drowning of Marzana ritual is, this, and I'm gonna read this a little bit directly. I've got several different sources on this ritual. Wikipedia, yes, is one, but I've also got it from another. The Magic Bohemia page has a good explanation of this as well. It's very difficult to get back to the original sources. There are original sources in Polish and in Czech, but copies of these are not very readily available. So I'm a bit reliant here on these secondary sources to talk about this. So the effigy of Marzana or Morana is drowned in a local river or stream. It's made of straw and it's wrapped in a white cloth. It can have necklaces of eggshells or other adornments, or even be made up as a bride. And this can be seen. There's one in the there's an effigy, and I'll probably have a picture of it in the YouTube version that's seen in the Ethnographic Museum in Prague, Prague's Kinsky Garden. Now, there's a book called Old Czech Legends from 1894. What was written in that book, just a quote from there: "During the time of snow and ice, long twilight and night, Morana ruled until the sun god began to look more gently and warmly on the face of the earth. As the ice chains and the water receded, the villages rejoiced. While singing, they took to the waters, the now free streams now." That's kind of a strange way of writing it. "And threw in the image of winter and death, and with joyous voices greeted Vesna, the sweet goddess of spring." Okay. So this is clearly a magical ritual where you have a straw effigy that is meant to symbolize, the land in the wintertime. Okay, whenever you start to use straw effigies, they tend to represent something agricultural, some kind of agricultural or land deity. The other version that occurs to me of the idea of using a straw effigy is in Ireland, and it's using the effigy of the Brídheog. Okay, and this is actually different. It's not an effigy that is burnt or drowned, but rather one that is carried into the house because it represents the goddess Brídhe. And this is usually around February 1st, February 2nd. That's the particular feast. Sometimes it's known as Imbolc because it has to do with the way in which, the times in which the lambs are being born. It has to do with, it has to do with lambing and with sheep being born. But so Imbolc has to do with this. It's usually this sort of halfway point, between the equinoxes of winter and spring, and Brídhe. The Brídhe festival, at least in the Celtic tradition, tends to also mark the beginning of spring, just as Samhain, which is we think of as Halloween, marks the beginning of winter. So, and as I was explained to me once by Alexei Kondratiev, he said, the idea behind that, there was sort of a ritual of giving the candle back to the farmhands who would go out early to take care of the animals would have a candle to go out with in the winter months because it was dark. And by the time you get to Brídhe's Day, it's light enough that they can give the candle back to their employers. So it's funny because that day has also become associated with candles. In the church, it's the Feast of St. Blaise. I remember as a Catholic, going to church and having them put the candles at your throat on that day. Okay, which is also known as Candlemas for that reason. So, not to digress too much into that, but certainly in Ireland, and I saw this in at least one of the folk museums in Western Ireland during my first trip there, is the idea of the Brídheog. And the Brídheog is also a straw effigy, but is often, brought into the house to represent, spring and this sort of revival of nature coming back to life. So it's welcomed into the house. In this particular case, the straw effigy is used and carried out, and it's carried out of the city or out of the village, and it's being taken to either be burned or drowned. And that, again, that's the symbol of, killing the winter deity. It has been explained, that particular ritual is often explained as the idea that you're sending Marzana back to the underworld through this process, okay? In the same way that one who would practice a sacrifice, perhaps a human sacrifice even, would, that person's soul is in some way is moving into another world. And the idea is that by doing this, Marzana is born again, beginning of the next winter. So she's dying, but it's not a permanent death. It's just, it's the idea of we're welcoming spring, so the old goddess, now has to die and go away. The season of death has to die, okay? And there is at least the more modern versions of it seem to have a vaguely Christian feel of, conquering death. But I would suggest that it's still a little bit different, because it's not the idea that you've killed death or tamped it down into its place. You've merely sent death back to the underworld, and death is will then return after it. But of course, it's done in this kind of fashion. Because you're dealing with an agricultural deity. And this really, in a way, gets to the point that I have often made about agricultural or mother goddess kinds of religions, in that there is this kind of violent element to it. There is this element of burning or drowning. Now, in this case, it's an effigy. Who knows if it was ever an actual person? I mean, that's, I don't think there's any evidence, I don't want to talk about things that don't have evidence. It's purely speculative. But by the same token, you do wonder. It is this idea of, symbolically taking, sending that aspect of the land goddess, that aspect of the dark feminine, back to the underworld. One thing that really interests me about this, is, I was interested into what the original mythology was connected to Marzana. We know that there's this ceremony. What is the original mythology? So let's talk about that for a minute. I had to find this on Brendan Noble's page. And he writes about this. This is his writing on Marzana is, he says, stories about the cycle of the seasons vary. Okay, so she is connected with that type of folktale. And primary sources, as he says, are basically non-existent. But a prominent tale is that of her marriage with Jarlo, her twin brother and a spring, war, and agriculture god. Now, right there, you can see that, he's got all of the elements of the Roman Mars. Okay. Spring, war, agriculture. They're all. It's interesting that that war is connected with agriculture. In this case, it's a masculine thing, but he is the twin of a feminine deity. And okay, so the story says that Marzana was a daughter of Perun, the god of thunder, and Malkosh, the great mother. In this story, she was once a nature goddess. When she was young, Jarlo was stolen by the god Welis and taken to the underworld of Nav, or Nawia. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, if it's Navia or Nav. When he returned, the twins did not know they were related, so they fell in love and were married. Okay, so I guess they didn't look much like each other, huh? The marriage between Marzana's nature and Jarlo's agriculture brought balance in nature and also peace temporarily between Perun and Welis. Okay, who obviously represent an upper world and a lower world, right? But then Jarlo committed adultery. Marzana killed him for his betrayal, turning her bitter and making her the winter deity we know today. This split is the reason for the season, as Marzana kills Jarlo in autumn, and he, along with a spring goddess, usually either Joanna or Vesna, kills her in the spring. The cycle continues annually, and neither can exist for long while the other survives. Okay. So this is an interesting idea of the cycle of, we have more modern versions of this cycle that may not be as ancient as people like to think or to claim. But you do, when we talk about the idea of the, marrying the harvest king and then having him cut down in the fall, there seems to be, this seems to be part of that kind of legend, that the legend that may actually be connected to this one. Rather than necessarily being something that's, that tends to be associated with Celtic myth or with Anglo-Saxon myth, with, possibly incorrectly. Okay, I haven't, until I actually research that angle of it, I don't really want to comment on that but there is some skepticism about the Oak and Holly King businesses, whether or not that's really as ancient as people like to claim it is. So until I've properly researched that, I don't want to make any assertions regarding that. But when we see that people reiterating that story, this potentially could be one of the inspirations for that. And Brendan Noble notes here, he says, the story shows a bit of tragedy lacking in many mythological stories. While Marzana is feared, she has a human element of desiring revenge and having her heart broken. An important note is most gods in Slavic mythology had a fear and worship element to them. Marzana was feared for death and disease that she wrought, but was also a crucial part of the world's cycle. Though she was definitely not the most praised, she was recognized because of both this fear and her important role. Okay. Yeah, because it's a question of whether or not the culture accepts death as part of life. And frequently we don't see that happen. We certainly don't live in a culture that accepts death. Although, again, the more modernized versions of it, if we think about it, the idea of conquering death in favor of spring, or killing death off. And obviously death is feared because, it can bring about, things don't grow in the winter. Things are barren. This is where it ends up having this association with a lack of fertility or barrenness. Though winter time is also, concurrently, it's the end of things, but it's also the beginning of the new cycle. So, it's there's the seeds of the new thing, but there's this focus on, this is what we have the idea of the Old Winter Hag, right? And we see this like in Irish myth, it was like the Cailleach or Garavog, or one of the one of the hags that is associated with winter. And similarly, as we see, at least in one version, as I've mentioned, Marzana is associated with Hecate because of that connection to the underworld and also to necromancy, things that are dealing with the dead specifically, and sorcery and things like that, because you're talking about something that comes from the underworld, something chthonic, something that comes from that hidden place that that should be respected but is also feared because of what it implies. And again, that idea of mort or death, the memory of the fact that we are mortal and that we don't live forever. And, that is something that, as we live and have our consciousness, is very difficult to fathom or face up to. And certainly by the time we get to more modern religious traditions, and by modern, I mean Christian traditions, when you start having these ideas of salvation becomes, it becomes as a conquering of death. And the question is, death is not really something that needs to be conquered. This, I feel more, is like there's a laying to rest, in a way. It's death is not, death is being laid to rest, for another, death's had its time on the earth, and now it's time, for death to return to the underworld and to have the new come and, and be part of things. Now it's time for spring and the spring goddess to take over, because the spring goddess is now the one who is in control. Although, now Noble's comment on the ritual, he says, come the spring equinox, the death of the winter goddess is celebrated with the drowning of Marzana. Though it was not recorded well before, it is still often practiced in areas such as Poland, and as a fun folk tradition. Now, this is something that school kids participate in, and that's what Joanna had been talking about. The idea that in elementary school they would all get together and, drown these effigies. And it says, now he says here, the festival's name gives a key insight into what happens. Different tribes and regions practice this differently, either by burning or drowning. the effigy. However, overall, the key is they were celebrating the end of winter and the coming of spring. In the burning traditions, it is often considered that Marzana is burned in the fire of one of the spring goddesses. So that would, of course, also indicate the influence of the sun as burning as well, because as the heat of the sun warms up, it provides that fiery warmth. In other myths that we've talked about, particularly when we're looking at some of the Irish myths, and also in Egyptian myths, where we see these manifestations of the sun, either as like the Eye of Belor, for example, in Irish myth, or as Sekhmet in the Egyptian, representing this harsh aspect of the sun that is actually destructive. Okay, but this is a thing that's actually, the sun is destructive of the barrenness of winter, so it's celebrated differently. And it says, upon Marzana's death, she travels to the underworld of Nabia until her return in autumn. Her appearance, says Marzana, is typically pictured as a pale, black, or light blonde-haired woman. Often she's portrayed wielding a sickle or a scythe, or scythe, however people like to. I'm hearing people say that differently now. I've only said scythe. And can either be beautiful or a horrific creature with claws and even fangs. In the latter example, she represents the fear of winter and is almost a demonic figure. Well, of course, because she's from the underworld. She is believed to live in a mirrored palace where two rivers meet. The palace is guarded by serpents, and the rivers are thought to be bottomless around her home. Okay, so let's stop here for a moment, because there's a lot of things that I've been talking about here. I'm talking about the festival, I'm talking about her imagery, and I'm talking about her myth. And, there's a lot to unpack here. So if we look at her as, so she's either black or light blonde haired, okay? Again, that may not have a whole lot of relevance. Typically, there's that dark and light motif, the black haired goddesses of the underworld, but not, again, as we see, that's not necessarily so. The sickle or the scythe, okay, that's a symbol of cutting away. It's a symbol of death. In the Greek myth, we see Kronos wielding the sickle, and that's where he cuts, basically castrates the sky god, and it's now heaven and earth are separated. Okay, it's that separating factor. It can often represent time, and it often represents death and harvest, as we know, because that's what's used to harvest the wheat, is the sickle or the scythe, and it's. We see, of course, the Grim Reaper holding that very same implement. We see Mother Kali holding that same implement in Hindu mythology, and in that case, she's cutting off the heads of the Asuras in the sense of the symbolic of removing, the ego, getting rid of the head, getting rid of the rational, getting rid of the head. Okay, and that I, that identity thing. The sickle is what cuts away at that. Just in the way that death does, because when we die, it's almost like you've lost your identity. Yes, there's people who may memorialize you and remember you. That's the only way that you retain your I. Otherwise, you are now part of this other kind of world of the dead. You've kind of moved into this collective space, as it were, or this space that might be considered void, depending on how you see, how you view the underworld. But yeah, and of course seen as a horrific creature, because this is the idea of the feminine as devouring and destroying. So this is not about birth. This is about death, obviously. Now the mythology of Marzana I found interesting, because we talk about death with her, right? We talk about and we talk about betrayal. Okay, so she's married to her twin. Okay, who she somehow doesn't know is her twin. But they, and then he ends up cheating on her. So now we also have this element of rejection and betrayal in the dark feminine, right? The angered female, the hell hath no fury like the woman scorned, right? It's this idea of betrayal, and that leads to a kind of isolation, like that which was united is now cut off. Things are, she is cut off from love and from her partner through the betrayal. And this creates a condition of isolation. And so what she does is she kills him, right? She said, and so now this is the woman, who has killed her love. This is the woman who is now the woman alone, and therefore that barrenness comes from, yes, there is no production of there's no creation that goes on in that kind of divine matchup, because oftentimes these divine marriages, so to speak, they're meant to be productive. I'll say procreative, not necessarily in the sense of spawning a lot of children, and that may well be what it is, but there is this spawning of life, this idea of life coming together. Again, to compare to the Hindu is Shiva Shakti, the idea that Shakti and Shiva together create the world, right? They are in their embrace, and so similarly, you have this idea that you need these two sides, but now it's lopsided. One thing has been cut off. And so therefore there is no growth, there is no life, there's only death. So this, it almost treats that as Marzana becomes a death goddess, through this imbalance that's been created. But as we see, she goes to the underworld, and which presumably is where he goes after he dies. And somehow the two end up being, the cycle starts again, and the marriage occurs again. It's like there's a separation, and then there's almost an amnesia that happens there, right? Like they don't remember they're related. Doesn't really say whether or not, when she becomes a death goddess, whether or not when her brother/lover goes to the underworld, whether or not they reunite there in any way. I don't see anything about that, but there is this sense of isolation and loneliness. And as I've mentioned in other places, that idea of separation is probably the thing that we fear the most. We don't like that separating factor. We don't like it in life. We spend a lot of time, even if you're somebody who considers yourself to be a loner or an introvert. Okay, a lot of times our feelings about the outside world come from our experiences. If we don't always feel welcome, if we feel like we are ostracized or excluded. And this is a script probably most of us have gone through or felt at some time in our lives. We have felt that sense of betrayal, that sense that, going to school or going to a social event or going to a thing and not feeling accepted by certain groups of people, or feeling like there has to be a competition or a jockeying to have that acceptance, or that the acceptance is very clearly superficial and not real. People like you as long as you behave a certain way or maintain a certain identity. So there becomes this sense of having to hide the real person that you are out of fear of being left on a path alone. Frequently, the person who decides to blaze their own trail and do it their own way can live very much alone or in isolation, or feel that they're alone a lot of the time, because you don't find, people are trying to seek out other like-minded people. People want to know that they're not alone, whether it be in their the things that they enjoy and are passionate about, or whether it be the things that they are traumatized or feel cut off about. They like to know that, they meet, the way that the rejects meet up with the other rejects, right? I mean, I know, Lord knows, I know I felt that way, certainly growing up a lot of times. There's, you connect with other people who can relate to your experience. And I remember Jung had said in psychological terms that a lot of times when in therapeutic situations, half the battle for a lot of people going through therapy is knowing that they're not they're not the only ones. Because when you feel like you're the only one, then you feel like, okay, it's got to be me. I've got to be, there's something that's got to be defective about me or wrong about me, right? People always, when they feel alone, when they see that there are others like them that they can relate to, see, now you have that community again. You don't feel isolated. So now when you're in a relationship with somebody like that, when you're married to somebody, and that person betrays you, okay, in some fashion. The betrayal doesn't always have to be infidelity, okay? Betrayals can happen in other ways too. And, the expectations. You can marry somebody with one, with one set of expectations, and then come to find that, you married each other with very different expectations, and, and they're not, the twain shall not meet. So it so these things can happen in other ways too. Or perhaps sometimes we feel that people have misrepresented themselves to us in order to maybe get something from us, and then they disappear. Or they're only engaged with us because they want something from us. So there's all of these ideas of rejection and betrayal, and with that comes rage, comes the desire for revenge. All of these things can be very natural emotional responses to that. And so with Marzana, this is what we see. We see her as now, the betrayal brings out the dark feminine. Okay. So that's another very interesting aspect. Now, when I look at her, her palace, she lives in a mirrored palace, and that's fascinating to me, where two rivers meet. Okay. So you've got, and the rivers, by the way, are really, really, really deep. Now, again, some people like the Jungian aspect of this. Some people really hate it. But, when you're talking about watery depths, you are talking about falling deep into the collective. You could also looking at it as kind of being deep into that abyss, that psychological space where your ego and your identity don't have any meaning. That's sort of it is a very Chtonic space. You are not, you're falling into those depths. And the question is, can you swim? Now, it's guarded by serpents, which, as we know in, sort of more, Christian or biblical imagery, the serpent is seen as, being connected to the underworld in the sense of being a deceiver, or as being connected to Satan or Samael or something like that. But probably in most cultures, the serpent is positive and is seen as this idea of regenerating life. The idea of life, that life-death cycle, okay, is often represented by the serpent. So, and of course her, and the idea of a mirrored palace, think about the idea of the mirror as being reflective, as being an area that has to do with, I think I immediately think of the term projection, the way in which, we don't have an identity, or we don't really know ourselves. You only kind of walk around in this space where you know who you are with respect not only to actual mirrors, like, in other words, you can't look at yourself unless you have a reflective surface, right? And you can't, and you often get to understand how you're being perceived in the world by how others respond to you. So there's always this constant mirroring that goes on. And it's very interesting that she kind of represents this sort of dark, feminine soul image kind of moving in this mirrored space that represents, the things that are reflected back at you. What's being reflected back at you? What's the truth that's being reflected back at you? Oftentimes, we don't ever get to know ourselves except in what's reflected back from others, whether it be something that we respond to very strongly, either positively or negatively, in other people. That often tells us something. It tells us something certainly about either what we're afraid of, or what we value, or what we think we are, or where we might be fooling ourselves that we are. So there's definitely this sense of, Marzana, this going to the underworld to really confront who one is. But that confrontation doesn't necessarily always have to be a scary thing. We always think of it as a scary thing, but it doesn't have to be. The underworld is also potentially a place, of probably the deepest numinous experience that you can have. So it's not, but there's definitely this perception here that's because you're going to a place that perhaps is dark and unknown and connected with a lack of growth in this case. In this case, death is almost seen as this lack of growth. Then you are, then you see it in a very fearful light. There's this, you're looking forward to the time when you're seeing things growing again, just like you do in your own life. When you reach points where you are, something has most definitely come to an end, and you're waiting for the new thing to take root and grow. That's actually the hardest place for most people. I deal with a lot of people who are in those spaces where they know what was there before is no longer there anymore. but they're still feeling very uncertain and very insecure and perhaps very anxious or sorrowful, or all kinds of emotions, because we're not trained to embrace the new. We always have to know what the next, we have to know the outcomes. We have to know the next steps. We have to be able to rationalize it, right? And rather than just allow ourselves to be surprised by the experience. So it's interesting. I mean, this image of death that we see in the Slavic countries, there's clearly an older component and perhaps a more modern one. Now, there was a little bit of background here on this procession, and I think this is the last thing I want to talk about. This whole ritual of the drowning of Marzana. Now, the question is, where does it fit into? Because we know that certainly a lot of the Slavic countries are either Orthodox or Catholic. So they practice, either Greek, usually Greek Orthodox, or they are Catholic. And so, where does this fit in? How does this mythology fit into that particular structure? And so, according to this says, and again, this is Wikipedia and the historical piece. They say the Catholic Church attempted to forbid this custom in 1420. The Synod of I think that's Poznan. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Instructed the Polish clergy, do not allow the superstitious Sunday custom. Do not permit them to carry around the effigy they call death and drown in puddles. However, both the custom and tradition prevailed. At the turn of the 18th century, there had been an attempt to replace it on the Wednesday preceding Easter with the newly introduced custom of throwing an effigy symbolizing Judas down from a church tower. This attempt also failed. Well, of course, because to make it about Judas is to completely miss the point. I mean, it's not about the betrayal. Marzana is the one who's betrayed, not the one who's committed the betrayal. Death is not a betrayal. So it's interesting. Today, the custom is celebrated at Spring Equinox on March 21st, which coincides with the traditional date of Yari Sveto. Okay. Now, they say the rite of drowning Marzana, often conducted with carrying bouquets of green twigs and branches, which literally is, it's a copse, was performed on the fourth Sunday of Lent, also called the White Sunday. The tradition of celebrating it on March 21st began in the 20th century. Most researchers agree that the custom of carrying the copse, also known as Grove, New Summer, or Walking with the Queen, from house to house, was earlier performed much later in the year, probably shortly after Easter. And so the copse itself is pine branches, twigs, or even entire small trees, usually pine or spruce. Now, of course, they're evergreen, right? Because evergreen tends to be used as a representation of everlasting life. So it is actually, this idea of eternal life rather than death. Or it's adorned with ribbons, handmade ornaments, eggshells, or flowers. Okay, so these are all spring associations. Of course, eggs have to, when we think about what an egg is, it's actually it's a baby chick. It's baby chicken, right? It's the shell. We think of the egg as representing the seed of new life, right? Carried from house to house. In some variations, a ritual doll is tied to the top branch. In others, a local girl accompanies the copse, hence walking with the queen. The copse is usually carried by girls who walk from house to house, dance and sing, and extend best wishes to the hosts. Some sources relate that the group also collected donations. Today, the ritual takes the form of bringing a decorated copse to the village after the ritual of drowning Marzana is completed. Okay, so this is, bringing in these new elements of life after drowning the goddess of death. This type of two-part ritual, destroying the effigy and then returning with the copse, has been observed in the Opole region and then different parts of Poland, Slovakia, Moravia, Bohemia, Lusatia, and southern Germany. In the 19th century, Oskar Kohlberg noticed that the copse had been carried around as a standalone custom without the prior destruction of Marzana around Krakow and Sandomierz, as well as the regions of Mazovia and Lesser Poland. So we see this death and this rebirth ritual. And as we can see, there's a lot of different elements connected to it. If we actually look at the mythology behind it, we get a sense of the attitude toward death. We see where the attempted Christianizations have been put in place, or perhaps even in some cases where a Christian or Catholic narrative may either supplant or somehow overlay or overlap whatever the original intent may have been. And we also look at the actual mythology of Marzana and see someone who is, somebody who is who she is, who serves the role that she serves, because of a betrayal and because of an isolation. And that's certainly an interesting thing to give us pause. So that's it for this week's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in my other work, you can please check out Chthonia.net. I have to spend some more time updating things on that site. It's been rather crazy lately because I've had a million things going on. I'm going to be giving a talk on Morrigan at the Magical Women Conference in London on October 15th. And there's possibly I have no confirmation yet, so I don't want to say, but there may be some other festivals and things that I will be presenting at this fall. And, and I'm also carrying on now with a lot of my one-to-one work that I've told people about. It's on my liminalreiki.com website, and, a lot of in-person stuff that I'm doing. So check there and check my social media as well for updates on the work that I'm doing. Chthonia Podcast. It's one word on Twitter and Instagram, 2 words on Facebook, just Chthonia on YouTube. Those are all my social media links. And if you would like to follow me on Patreon, patreon.com/Chthonia. I'd usually get the first heads up on the podcast, usually extra material every month. And when there's new news about new projects and things that are coming out, generally patrons are the first to know and perhaps to get a chance to either give input, participate, or or perhaps get things, get stuff that I may first crack at something I might otherwise wait to make available to the rest of the public. So with that, thank you again so much for listening. Thanks again to all of my awesome patrons, and till the next time.